Hello everyone, this is the second remote revision session that I've been sending out to you to replace the normal breakfast clubs that we would ordinarily do in school. So this session complements the catch-up session that you did on Brumley this week. So if you've done the catch-up session, which I'm hoping you have, this should help you develop some of the thoughts that you had during that session and should give you some new ideas that you can add to your notes. So if you haven't got any already, you need to go and get some lined paper so that you can be making lots of notes during this session, because there'll be lots of different ideas for you to think about. So just a quick reminder, remote revision is all about just giving you some new ideas, giving you some other things to think about. So I'm hoping that you might think things like, oh, I hadn't thought about that before, or that's interesting, I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but I'm going to write it down and have a little bit of a think about it. Or hopefully I might give you some different ways of looking at the play. So remember, all of this isn't set in stone, it's just me talking through some things that me and Mrs. Buckle have talked about with students in the past at breakfast clubs. So it should give you things to think about. Okay, so just to start us off, I want you to have a little think about what two of our texts, and Inspector Calls and Macbeth, have in common to get you going. Lots of things in common in many ways, but obviously very different. So they're both plays, so they've got the same form, and they are both telling a story. Okay, but they share a lot of these characteristics as well, because both writers are using all of those techniques that were listed there. They need characters, they need settings, they have to think about the order in which they're going to plot their events. They think about their openings and closings. They think about when characters enter and exit and why they enter and exit at that particular point. They're both thinking about where to place their moments of tension and high drama. Where do they shift from a moment of tension to a kind of a quieter moment or a dramatic moment, those shifts. Where do they place cliffhangers? How do they use time? And what kinds of patterns that there might be in their play? Are there repetitions? Are there cycles? Do things kind of start and end pretty abruptly, or do things kind of come around again and revisit things that happened earlier on? So both Shakespeare and Priestley are using many of the same devices and are thinking about the same things with these texts, although they're telling very different stories. Okay. So they're making us think about different things, and they're making us, they're trying to create different meanings. So they make very different structural choices. You will see these things in both of their texts, but they use them or they place them in different places. Okay, so we're talking today about the structure of an Inspector Calls, and we're talking about, or we're thinking about some of the choices that Priestley is making in relation to structure. So as I said to you before, it ties in with what you were doing in the catch-up session when you were mapping out Brumley, because you were looking at setting, and we're gonna kind of build on setting to think about the larger structural choices that Priestley is making across the play as a whole. Okay, so some of this that I'm going to talk about briefly at the beginning here is a repetition of some of the things that we talked about in the catch-up session. So it's just a little quick bit of revision for you, or if you missed the catch-up session, which I hope you didn't, it's a chance to kind of fill in a gap there for you. So as we said, Brumley's a fictional town in the Midlands, but it's representative of many towns, isn't it? Both from 1912 or the 1940s, or even now, we can see similarities. A town like Brumley in the 1920s would have, in the 1912, would have had many factories because of the impact of the Industrial Revolution, and because of that, then there would be housing, which wouldn't necessarily be of a great standard, but for factory workers like Eva Smith. And we talked a little bit in the catch-up session about the fact that Eva Smith has gone to Brumley from a more rural, smaller town or village, and the reason why probably is that she has gone there for work. Okay, however, within the town there are also going to be areas that are very much the areas where the wealthy factory owners or the wealthy business owners like the Berlins live, perhaps more on the outskirts of the town. The accommodation for workers like Eva Smith would be more towards the centre of the town and would be less, I was going to say less luxurious, but would be less sanitary as well. The Berlins would have much more space, and they've got kind of all the trappings of wealth. from your work in the catch-up session, we know that the town has got things like a theatre, a bar, a police station, an infirmary, shopping area with large dress shops or department stores like Millwards. But we also know from our work in the catch-up session that it is a deeply divided town, with lots of class division between genders, division between ages, and it's a class that is kind of founded on division and conflict in many ways. And it's a town that is all parts of the town aren't accessible to all of the characters who live there. And we talked a little bit last time about the difference between the ways that Mr. Berlin might describe or experience the town and the difference between how Eva or Sheila might describe or experience the town. So keep those things in mind today. As I'm talking, if at any time I'm going too fast or you want to kind of pause to jot things down, just keep stopping the video and then keep picking it up when you're ready, because today's session really is a lot about me giving you lots of ideas and you making notes. So it's less about you completing little tasks. So just stop it, get down everything you want to write or copy down notes from the screen and then pick it up again when you're ready. You're kind of in control of the time, really. Okay, so moving on a little bit. So again, these are images that you saw during the catch-up session, but just to remind you of the difference of the experience of the working classes and the poorer members of Brumley in comparison to the Berlins and the Crofts. And the thing that's kind of striking is the space there and the quality of their accommodation and living and working conditions, isn't it? The Berlins and the Crofts obviously have a much more luxurious, indulgent, comfortable experience, don't they? Okay, again, just to recap, last time we talked about the contrasts that Priestley is using his setting to set up. Okay, he establishes all of these contrasts for us to think about as an audience. So the contrast between the classes, and consequently the contrast between the experience of people with wealth, money, status, and those who are poor, is setting up the contrast between men and women. Men as powerful, influential people in Brumley society, women less so, particularly working class women. Men being people who have power, men as people who have time to kind of indulge their wants and desires, who have leisure time, who have time to drink and socialise. Women less inclined to have that or less able to have those things. Mrs. Berlin can kind of move more freely around Brumley, but she's not doing the same things that her husband might do, or she's definitely not doing the same things that Gerald and Eric do. We don't hear about her socialising in the same way that they do. When she meets with other people, it's as part of a committee. So there's kind of very strict expectations about what people can and can't do. And Eva Smith and Sheila, because they are younger women, have a much more limited experience, and because they are women. Although arguably Eva Smith has a greater degree of freedom in Brumley than Sheila, because as a working class woman, she's kind of out there fending for herself and she can kind of move through Brumley more freely than Sheila can. You know, we hear about Sheila going to Millwards, she goes with her mother, and the fact she's with her mother kind of possibly makes it a more restrictive experience for her. But that's something to think about as well. And then obviously the other opposition that he's setting up through this setting is the opposition between capitalism and socialism, and that idea of what a capitalist society provides for those who are rich as opposed to those who are poor, and what it would mean if we started to divide up this wealth and share it and try to create a more equal society. What would Brumley look like then? Okay. So some things for you to think about there. Okay, so we talked a lot last time about the wider setting of Brumley and the time, but also the things that are on the slide now are really important things for you to think about, and these are all structural choices that Priestley is making. So it's important to remember that all of the action is taking place indoors. It takes place inside the Berlin household, and so the audience witness that. And although we hear about things that have taken place in Brumley and outside, we don't see that. We never see that represented through action on stage. So he chooses the Berlin family home as a setting. The action is taking place in one room, in the dining room, over one evening. or part of an evening. Characters leave the stage quite often, but we stay in the dining room. So the audience, when Eric leaves, we don't go with Eric. We don't see what he gets up to in the time when he's not in the dining room. So there's a kind of naturalistic feel to it. Because obviously in real life you can't be in two places at once. You're in the room that you're in, and that's what Priestley is replicated on the stage. We stay in the dining room. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a little while. And as I've said, we hear about other places, but we never see them. I started this session by thinking about how An Inspector Calls is similar to Macbeth, because they're making choices about settings, about characters, about order of events, and so on. These choices that are on the screen at the moment are very different from the ones that Shakespeare is making with Macbeth, aren't they? If you think about the different settings that the play moves through, and the audience goes to those settings. We go to Macbeth's house, we go to the battlefield, we go to the home of the Macduffs, and we go to England. It takes place over quite a long period of time. We're not clear about how long it's been going on for, but Priestley is very different from Shakespeare in that respect. In Macbeth, Shakespeare is kind of given it quite a grand, almost epic scale, isn't it? And there's lots of movement, but Priestley is doing the opposite. He's really confining the action of An Inspector Calls. He's limiting it, and he's limiting the audience's experience of the wider setting. So it's for you to kind of note that down and have a little bit of a think about that, and think about how that influences the messages and the meanings that Priestley is creating overall. So let's look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. So let's have a look at, from the opening stage directions, this description. It should be pretty familiar to you now. I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself. Of that choice of setting it in the dining room of the Burling household. There are two questions for you to consider and jot down your thoughts. What do the stage directions at the start of the play reveal about the family, their status and wealth, and their relationships with each other? And secondly, what does this reveal about the family and the wider purpose of the play? So you might want to pause the video now and take a moment or two to jot down your thoughts, and then join me again when you're ready. Okay, so all of the information in the stage directions is showing the elevated position of the Burlings, isn't it? It's marking them out as very comfortably middle class, and demonstrably so. You know, if you visit their house, you can tell they've got money. You can tell that they're sort of a respectable family, you're supposed to be, and that they're kind of all in it together there. That on the surface, they're all kind of present and cozy and friendly with each other, suggested by the lighting. But obviously there's that hint that when the inspector arrives, he's going to show us the truth of the situation, and maybe that these relationships with each other at the beginning, and maybe some of the elements of their status and trappings of wealth are hiding something, or something of a facade. It's suggesting about the family that they're kind of reaping the benefits of capitalism. They're really comfortable, they're privileged, they're well off. But also it's crucial that this is happening at the beginning of the play, isn't it? Because Priestley is using these stage directions to highlight to the audience that the Burlings have kind of got it all at this point, haven't they? They've got the lovely house, they've got the furnishings, but also they've got the food, and they're celebrating, and they're kind of really pleased with themselves and quite smug. But he's setting them up to lose it. It's going to be very different by the ending of the play, isn't it? What he's also doing is setting them up in opposition to characters like Eva Smith and the working classes, and probably Inspector Goole. Okay, Inspector Goole, who becomes an intrusive presence in this cosy middle-class house in Brumley, doesn't live a life like the Burlings do, and his home life won't be as luxurious as this. So Priestley is kind of using these stage directions really early on to foreshadow the fall of the Burlings, and to stress what they have got to lose, and to exemplify the great change that is going to occur for them as the play goes on. Okay, so still looking at the stage directions, but two different questions for you to think about. Firstly, why does Priestley confine the action of the play to one room? And secondly, why did he choose the dining room? Why didn't he confine the action of the play to a bedroom or to the sitting room? He specifically chooses the dining room. Have a think about that, note down your ideas, and come back when you're ready, please. Okay, so confining the action of the play to one room is very restrictive, and it, for me, it creates tension, and it sort of puts the audience in there with the Berlins, and we can't escape. We have to stay, we have to let the play run its course, we have to let the inspector say what he's going to say, and we've got to deal with it. So we're kind of stuck in there. So it heightens the tension. And it means that those characters have to tell their stories to let us find out a little bit about what was going on in the wider world. Okay, so it's a kind of a good format to invite the characters to tell stories. Okay, also it harks back to the kind of traditions of detective story writing. If you think back to your kind of early detective stories, things like The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, the early Sherlock Holmes ones, often detective stories were set in a limited setting, and the mystery would kind of unfold in that limited setting, and you would have a limited number of suspects, and you could have the kind of locked room setting where a body is found in a room or something is stolen from a room, and it's sort of like there's this limited number of suspects who could have done it, but how on earth did they get into the room? How did they get out? So I think Priestley's kind of nod into that tradition of detective stories, which I really quite like. I think that's interesting. The issue of choosing the dining room is again another interesting one, and this kind of connects back to something I was talking to you about before Christmas when I talked about the banqueting scene in Macbeth, and that idea of scenes around food and dining and banquets and things like that are usually like, it's quite an intense moment, and it's a gathering, and it brings people together. So it gives an audience, usually if you're using the dining room, there's several people there, but also it's to do with that idea of indulgence and being satisfied. The Berlins are indulging in a really good dinner for a special occasion. And obviously, when you're kind of really indulging and being really satisfied like that, it's a comment on your status. And it's also a suggestion that you're kind of a bit smug. The characters are a bit smug, a bit self-satisfied. They're kind of all about consuming. They're about eating and filling themselves up and kind of gorging themselves. It sort of hints at ideas about greed, really, doesn't it? And the idea that the food is kind of abundant and lavish because it's a celebration. And obviously in Macbeth, a big dramatic event happens with the appearance of the ghost of Banquo. And actually, you know, when I'm saying that out loud, that's not that different from what happens in An Inspector Calls. If you think about the kind of ghost of Eva Smith haunting this scene, or the fact that Inspector Goole is called Goole and a ghoul is a ghost, we have an appearance of a ghost at this kind of moment of indulgence and a moment of satisfaction and happiness, and it's kind of the perfect setting in lots of ways. But also, again, the idea of the food and all of the lovely luxurious things that the Berlins have got contrasts with the very little that Eva Smith had, and contrasts with the lack of happiness in her life. So it's Priestley's kind of setting up all of those ideas as well. Okay. Finally, on this issue, for me, it's kind of also like we've pulled up a chair at that dining room table as well, and we're kind of in it, and we are as involved as the Berlins, which I'll keep coming back to that idea. Okay, moving on. So again, still with the stage directions here, but another question for you to consider. How does the setting help to build tension and develop the emotional response of the audience? I've touched on that a little bit, so jot down your thoughts and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so I have said already, it's kind of a very claustrophobic setting, isn't it? If you haven't got the word claustrophobic down in your notes, I would get that down now. We are, as I just said, like an additional kind of member of this dinner party. When we take our seat in the theatre, it is like we are pulling up a chair at the Berlings' dinner table, and we have to stay in that room. We can't get out. When Eric goes, we can't go. When Gerald leaves, we can't go. We can't go with Mrs. Berlin and Sheila to have tea in the other room. We are trapped there, and we have to stay there until the inspector has finished his inquiries, and that makes us feel involved, doesn't it? And it makes us feel as if we are complicit in the Berlin's crimes and irresponsibility and neglect of other members of society. And that is so effective on Priestley's behalf because it is right, isn't it? We are as guilty as the Berlins in many ways. Okay, you know, we're not saying we've done things as extreme as Eric, and we haven't sacked people. But we've done things that are careless of others, haven't we? Or we've done things that are selfish, that we've done to kind of protect ourselves or satisfy ourselves in some way. So we've all been guilty in some small way of being neglectful of other people. And you know that we have, on social media recently, in light of things that have happened in society, specifically, in light of what happened to Caroline Flack, there was that whole campaign, wasn't there, of if you can be anything in the world, be kind. Well, if we live in a society where we have to be told to be kind, then obviously there are members of our society who are just as bad as the Berlins. So the setting is so clever in building up tension and making the audience feel as complicit as the Berlins, and making us feel like, oh, this evening might be the evening that we are found out as well. Hopefully we won't be found out. Hopefully we will leave the theatre thinking, yeah, I have been a bit selfish in the past, or I have been a bit careless of others, and I'm going to change. That's the point, isn't it? Okay. So moving on a little bit to think about the wider setting in terms of the time period. So just recapping some of those things that you do already know. I'll just give you a minute to just read through some of that information there. A little reminder about what 1912, the Edwardian era, was like. So just take a moment. Sorry, I've just noticed that there's a typing error on the board there, and that Priestley should have an E between the L and the Y. Sorry about that. Have a little think about why that's important, why this contextual information is important. Looking at the last bullet point, a reminder that although it's set in 1912, it was being performed for audiences in 1946 and right up to the present day. Things were very different in 1946, weren't they? The audience would have experienced 2 world wars. Some members of the audience, many members of the audience, would have experienced loss, and their lives would have changed dramatically because of as a consequence of the wars. But we've got an audience who have elected a socialist government, so things have changed. Okay, it's not the world of 1912 that Priestley felt things hadn't changed. Things have changed, so that really should influence what you think Priestley's message might be. He's perhaps not saying now we need a dramatic change, but is he warning us not to let things slip back? Is he warning us not to be complacent? Is he saying we still need to be vigilant? We still need to be careful and be responsible for other people, and we need to see ourselves as part of a society and part of a whole thing that we all have to contribute to. So I think he perhaps is warning against being complacent, and saying we must keep on changing and kind of evolving and looking forward and thinking positively. Okay, so obviously use of time is a huge thing in this play, and it's really obvious from the 1912 setting and the fact that he chooses to set it in the past, and he allows that to kind of put the audience in a position of additional knowledge, that we are kind of privileged in comparison to the characters on stage. We know more than them, and that's really important. But what else is going on with time here? So again, some extra information for you to think about and to make notes on. So as I said earlier, it takes place over one evening and is presented to the audience in real time. So this means that the story lasts exactly as long as the play is on stage. And it means that it's different from something like Macbeth, which I said to you before, kind of takes place over several days, weeks, months, perhaps. That's not the case, okay? And arguably, the length of time that the inspector takes to question Mr. Berlin is realistic. It could be the length of time that a police inspector would take to question somebody, okay? So there's the time is kind of reflecting real time, and it's kind of quite naturalistic in that sense. The other thing to think about, as we've said before, point 1 there, it's just the people in the dining room being questioned and being spoken to, and it's just their action that is being depicted. And what you need to think about is how Priestley manages to build such drama, conflict and tension with just those limited people and that limited setting. How does he do that? We've already started to talk about that. It's for you to have a little bit of a think about that further. Arguably, the answer's in the question there. The fact that it is just that limited space and it is just those people there, that's what starts to contribute to the creation of tension. And all of this, as point 2 says, creates to the sense that it is a real interrogation, that it's confined, the family is limited, they can't escape. And as it says in point 3, we are trapped there with them. And it is like Priestley is saying to us, we're involved in it, you're complicit in it, we're all going to stay here until this mystery is solved, until we know exactly what happened to Eva Smith, but also until we learn our lesson. And arguably, since it was first performed in 1946, we haven't learned our lesson, which is why when it's on stage in Newcastle, it sells out all the time. I know that a lot of the reasons why it sells out is because it's teachers buying them up for their classes, but it also sells out because it is still a tremendously popular play and it is still really relevant. We have not learned our lessons. We are still selfish, we can still be irresponsible, we still have an imbalance of power, and we still have a society that is based largely on conflict. So there are still lessons for us to learn from this play. Okay, so we've talked about this setting quite a lot, and it is Mr. Berlin's setting, it is his house, but it's interesting to note before we move on that he is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all of the characters in this setting. We've heard this phrase, an Englishman's home is his castle, and that idea that in your own house you're kind of in control and powerful and should feel safe and secure and all of those things. But that Priestley kind of destabilizes that idea entirely in this play. And Mr. Berlin seems very ill at ease, even from the outset. He's desperately trying to gain the approval of the Crofts. He's always sort of trying to build himself up and kind of exaggerate how important he is. He seems desperately insecure, really, in many ways, doesn't he? And he is immediately threatened by the inspector. And the fact that the inspector is so unflappable kind of makes that worse. So we kind of view him as a powerful character. He's a man, he's older generation, he's got lots of authority, he's got money. We would see him as kind of being powerful, but he seems to be very concerned with losing power and losing control, and that makes him very uncomfortable. So that's quite an interesting thing to just take note of at this point. Okay. Moving on, a few other structural features for you to just have a think about. So we've talked about time in terms of the time settings, but think about how he uses time across the play. Think about how much time he allocates to the different characters for their interrogations. Think about the timings of when acts begin and end and the use of cliffhangers. Think about how Priestley orders his events and where he places moments of drama and revelations, and think about how the play begins and ends. And we're going to have a look at some of those things in a little bit more detail as we go. Okay, so still thinking about time and thinking about it as a structural feature, it's quite interesting to look at Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is a Greek philosopher who we talk about in relation to tragedy. And when Aristotle was talking about tragedy and what we expect of tragedy, he talked about the 3 unities. And they are the unities of action, time, and place. And you'll see them on the screen now. So normally, and I know some of you will be thinking, I think I talked about this in relation to Macbeth, or we had a lesson on this with Macbeth, and you're quite right. It is something that we would think about in relation to Macbeth more than an Inspector Calls, but actually they apply very much here. So if you think about place, it says in terms of place, the action should be limited to a single location. Well, in an Inspector Calls, we've got that. The Berlin's dining room, the action takes place in the Berlin's dining room. So we have that feature. In terms of time, the action should occur in one day. And we've got the idea that the action takes place over one evening in an Inspector Calls. So Priestley is conforming to 2 out of 3 of Aristotle's 3 unities here. And the final one, action. Play should have only one storyline with a few or no subplots. Well, we've got room for debate here, haven't we? We've got the one storyline of Eva Smith, so that agrees with that. But Priestley then brings in flashbacks and subplots, and we find out a little bit more about the other characters. So there's a little bit of debate there, but largely Priestley is very interested in time in a lot of his writing, and in this play it does seem like he is observing what Aristotle said in relation to the 3 unities. So if he is doing that, then we have to ask ourselves what this suggests, and whether or not this suggests that actually And Inspector Claus isn't a detective story, or it isn't a ghost story, or it's not a morality play, as perhaps we might normally think. It's a tragedy. And if you want to have a little bit of a think about that, you should be asking yourself, well, whose tragedy is it? Is it the tragedy of the Berlin family, this family that were kind of high status and fell from that high status and kind of suffered and made mistakes in the same way that somebody like Macbeth does? Or kind of controversially, would this be the tragedy of Eva Smith? And I'm saying controversially because tragedies normally are concerned with people of high status, aren't they? And Eva Smith isn't high status in terms of she's not noble and she's not wealthy and she's not a queen or a princess or anybody like that. But Priestley certainly confers a lot of status on her, doesn't he, as a character who can teach a moral lesson. So I don't know, it's an unconventional interpretation, but it's interesting to look at the use of Aristotle's three unities here and to kind of push yourself to have a think about what Priestley might be doing. Okay, moving on. So I've just said he's observing the unities of time, action and place, and that it takes place in one setting and it's just over one evening. But now I'm going to contradict myself because it's not just as simple as that, is it? And we know this because, you know, in an earlier lesson you were mapping out Brumley and you were looking at all of the other settings that were involved, even if we just hear about them. But also if we start to kind of create a timeline of events, and we look at the dates that are mentioned by the other characters, and we look at how the inspector teases out the timeline of Eva Smith's life, it takes place over much more than just one evening, doesn't it? And the whole thing sort of goes from September of 1910 up to Eva Smith's suicide in 1912. And I've mapped it out for you here, and you probably should copy this down, okay, so that you've got it for your notes. And you can see where she gets and loses jobs, where she begins relationships with characters, and where she goes to Mrs. Berlin for help before her eventual suicide. And also, if you look at that in a little bit more detail, you can see that there's some interesting uses of the seasons on behalf of Priestley. Okay, so you'll notice that it begins with autumn and winter, with those September and December dates there, which in literature, when we talk about writers' use of the seasons, autumn and winter has connotations of endings, doesn't it? Or it has connotations of the endings of life, or autumn being kind of the beginnings of older age. So metaphorically, Priestley is using those autumn and winter settings to foreshadow that this is the beginning of the end for Eva Smith and the Berlins. Okay, and then we get things starting to happen in the summertime. Yeah, she gets the job at Millwards in December, and she's sacked from that in January. But from March to September, we kind of have this sort of summer period where she's in this relationship with Gerald, which ultimately the audience kind of condemn that relationship with Gerald on Gerald's behalf. But he does provide her with a period of happiness, and he does provide her with the basics that people need in life to survive and to thrive. He gives her a roof over her head, and he provides her with some money, and she can eat and things like that. And I know that we condemn Gerald's use of her and that he is perhaps manipulating her and controlling her, but things are better for her then. So it's a brief moment perhaps of happiness and hope for her. But then we come back to the kind of winter period in November of 1911, where she is, this is obviously a real low point with the sexual assault by Eric. And that goes on into a period of hopelessness until perhaps in the spring, we have the pregnancy, which could, which obviously is again the beginning of the kind of final stage towards her death. But pregnancy is symbolic of new life and hope there. So the idea that she commits suicide in the springtime is a really awful juxtaposition there, isn't it? And, you know, furthered by the fact that she is a young woman. She's not in the winter of her life. She's not in old age. She is young, and she's full of hopes and dreams and ambitions. So there's a kind of horrible juxtaposition there in the fact that she ends her life feeling so desperate, and that is in the springtime, a time which usually signifies hope and rebirth and renewal and new life. So again, just some really interesting things going on structurally there that you might want to think about and jot down some ideas about. Again, join me back, press play when you're ready. Okay, some other things to think about in terms of the order of event. So sorry, it might look like a little bit of a jumble, so I'll just talk it through. So just again, things that I've noticed, some observations. Remember, I keep talking to you about the importance of just noticing things. So if we look at the order of events and the revelations, so the order of interrogations there. So it goes Arthur, Sheila, Gerald, Sybil, Eric. So really straightforward, male, female, male, female, male. And then it goes someone from the older generation, younger generation, Gerald kind of in between, sort of getting into his 30s, back to the older generation, back to the younger. So we talked with settings about how Priestley was using the setting to kind of to create contrasts, juxtapositions, conflict. This goes on, doesn't it, in the order? We've got the kind of conflict between male and female, conflict between older and younger generation. And then we've got, you can see the kind of order of events exemplifies their reactions as well. So it goes unwilling to change and accept responsibility from Arthur. Sheila, very quickly willing to change. Gerald could go either way. He's sort of secretive initially. We're not entirely sure that he's really kind of learning and developing. And arguably, Gerald is the character who has got most to lose. You know, if we all buy into what the inspector is saying and we disregard Mr. Berlin's idea that community is a nonsense, and if we opted for a more socialist society, Gerald has kind of landed aristocracy, somebody whose family has always had money and that has been passed down through the generations. A young male who has inherited that wealth. He's got the most to lose, hasn't he, if society hugely changes? So he might kind of understand the inspector's message in terms of morality. He might agree to a certain extent that he has done something wrong, but whether or not he's fully ready to embrace change, like Sheila, is up for debate, isn't it? And well, it's ambiguous, really. We just don't know. So then from him, we get back to Sybil, who mirrors Arthur in that she is completely unwilling to change and accept responsibility, but ends with Eric, who arguably is the character who has committed a crime and the worst crime against Eva Smith, but is somebody with whom we have a little bit of hope, and he accepts responsibility and suggests that he is willing to change, like Sheila. However, a student pointed out in an essay that I was reading this week that and it's kind of really stuck with us, that Eric is drinking heavily throughout the play and is possibly very, very drunk by the end. So can we really place a lot of faith in what Eric says? Is he going to feel the same when he sobers up? I don't know. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And again, you probably want to pause for a minute and get those things down into your notes, and join me again when you're ready. So we kind of talked earlier about the importance of the beginning and that idea of setting the Berlins up to be this kind of successful, happy, confident family, really pleased with themselves and kind of full of happiness at the beginning. But the end is a complete contrast, isn't it, from that? The end is chaos, confusion, disorder, despair, characters not really knowing what to do anymore and what's going to happen next. So there's that huge contrast. The ending's fascinating to me because we've got so many shifts and so many kind of like, there's so many endings, isn't there? When the inspector goes, it feels like, all right, that's the end. He goes on that big dramatic speech and he leaves in quite a flourish, and they're all sort of stood there processing and trying to make sense of everything. That feels like the end, and the audience is trying to make sense of everything as well. And we've learned a bit of a lesson there, but then it's not the end. So then it sort of feels like another ending when the Berlins call the police, and they, for a moment, think it's a hoax, and they're kind of like, oh, we've been had, and it's a moment of a release of tension, and it kind of feels like, oh, that was a bit of a twist. So they hadn't really done anything. Oh, so this is the end. But then we get to the real ending, the actual ending, this cliffhanger, this further twist, and this revelation. brought on by Mr. Berlin initiating the calls to the police station and to the infirmary, that a new inspector is coming. So as I said before, not everybody has learned their lesson. Not everybody is willing to change, as we just saw. And it seems like now's the chance to kind of put that right. And can you learn from your mistakes, and can you accept responsibility, and can you change? So a new inspector is going to come. The next slide's got some information from Priestley himself, which I think is a really interesting point to end on and for you to have a think about. So in the 1970s, Priestley said, "Even during the last 10 years, I've had innumerable letters from graduates, undergraduates, high school students from everywhere demanding to know who or what the inspector was. There haven't been furious arguments about this. Oddly enough, they never asked about the second inspector who was on his way, though this is not simply a dramatic twist, but really the key to the play." Now, you need to think about that. And I know this from experience. Every time we watch this film and every time we read it with classes, students go, "What? Well, who's the inspector? Who is he? Is he a ghost?" And largely they're talking about the first inspector. But as Priestley says, it's that second inspector that we need to think about. Who is he? Is it the same one coming back? Is it a new inspector? And Priestley's saying he's not doing it kind of gratuitously for a fun twist at the end. The meaning of the play for him is encapsulated in this second inspector. So you might want to copy that quote down and keep it in your notes, because it's really interesting and really useful. But what does it mean? Is it a new inspector? Is Priestley saying, look, it doesn't matter what just happened, it's all going to happen again with a new inspector, and what matters now is, are they going to tell the truth this time? Is that what he's saying? Is that what he wants us to think about? And Priestley's saying that it's really the second inspector who's crucial. He's the key. But if he's so important, why don't we see him? Which makes me think that it's not about the Berlins and it's not about the inspector. It's about the audience, and the fact that the audience now in the theatre is going, hang on a minute, who's this new inspector? Who's he? And was the first one not real? Was the first one a time traveller? What was going on? So the fact that the audience is now thinking about the inspector, or hopefully Priestley was hoping that they would be thinking about the inspector, perhaps tells us that actually the meaning of the play is that it's about us, it's about the audience, and it's about what are we going to do. And when we are inspected, sort of metaphorically speaking, are we going to face up to our responsibilities and accept what we have done in life and what we can do in life, and how we can make a really great community for everybody, and how we can make life meaningful and purposeful and be kind of outward looking rather than insular? Does the second inspector make us think about our responsibilities? I don't know. So I'm going to leave it there for you to have a think about, and you can jot down some thoughts. I think it would be great if you took a photograph of all the notes that you've made and send them to your English teacher, so they can be really proud of you and give you lots of praise. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back probably next week with another remote revision session for you. Thanks very much. Bye.